The scream that tore through the Virginia countryside on March 15, 1847, was unlike any sound the residents of Cumberland County had ever heard before. It wasn't the desperate cry of an animal being led to slaughter, nor the anguished wail of a woman in the throes of childbirth. No, this was something infinitely more disturbing, according to court documents that remained sealed for decades, only discovered long after the fact. 13 members of the Peton family were found dismembered within their own plantation home, their remains arranged with such surgical precision that it utterly baffled investigators. The local sheriff's report, buried away for over a century, described cuts so clean, so methodical, that they appeared to be the work of someone possessing an intimate, almost unnatural knowledge of human anatomy. What makes this case even more bone-chilling is that the prime suspect, a slave known only as Isaac, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind evidence that would make even the most seasoned lawmen question everything they thought they understood about the peculiar institution of slavery. Before we continue with the harrowing story of Isaac and the Peton Plantation, if you find yourself fascinated by these dark, hidden chapters of American history, the ones deliberately erased from textbooks, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Together, we unearth the most disturbing secrets buried in our nation's forgotten past. Also, let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to see just how far these long, buried stories reach. The events that transpired at Peton Grove would forever alter how authorities in antebellum Virginia perceived the relationship between master and slave, though the full truth of what happened that March evening would remain locked away in courthouse vaults until long after the Civil War had ended. The story itself begins in Cumberland County, Virginia, during the spring of 1847, a land steeped in contradictions. Rolling hills draped in tobacco stretched as far as the eye could see, creating a patchwork of vibrant green that spoke volumes about the region's prosperity. The James River wound its way through the countryside, providing both vital transportation and the lifeblood for the plantations that lined its banks. It was a place where genteel society flourished on the backs of enslaved labor, where plantation owners gathered for elaborate dinners, while their human property toiled in the fields from sunrise until sunset. Peton Grove sat on nearly 2,000 acres of prime Virginia soil, about 15 miles southwest of the county seat at Cumberland Courthouse. The plantation had remained in the Peton family for 3 generations. It was built by Josiah Peton in the 1760s, using wealth accumulated through tobacco cultivation and what locals euphemistically referred to as agricultural investments. The main house, an imposing 3-story structure with right columns and wraparound porches, commanded a sweeping view of the entire property from its position atop a gentle rise. By 1847, the plantation was under the management of Cornelius Peton, Josiah's grandson, a man known throughout the county for his sharp business acumen and his particularly distinctive approach to managing enslaved workers. Unlike some of his neighbors who relied on overseers, Cornelius prided himself on maintaining direct, personal control over every aspect of plantation life. He was a man of medium height with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that he kept meticulously groomed. His wife, Margaret, was the daughter of a wealthy Richmond banking family, and together they had 4 children: Samuel, aged 22, Elizabeth, 19, Thomas, 16, and young Mary, just 12 years old. The Peton household also included Cornelius's elderly mother, Prudence, who at 78 still maintained strict oversight of all domestic arrangements, and Margaret's unmarried sister, Catherine, who had come to live with them after their father's death the previous year. The extended family was completed by Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Jonathan Pettin, a physician who had studied in Philadelphia before returning to Virginia to establish his practice. Jonathan frequently stayed at the plantation when treating patients in the more rural areas of the county. What truly set the Pettin plantation apart from others in the region was not merely its size or productivity, but the unusual background of its workforce. Cornelius had inherited 43 enslaved individuals, but over the years, he had acquired several others under circumstances that raised more than a few eyebrows among his peers. Unlike most slaveholders who purchased their labor from established markets in Richmond or Norfolk, Cornelius had a peculiar habit of acquiring individuals whom other owners had deemed problematic or unmanageable. It was through this very practice that Isaac came to Pettin Grove in the autumn of 1844. The man who would later become known throughout Virginia by a far more sinister name had originally belonged to a plantation in neighboring Prince Edward County, where he had worked in the slaughterhouse. His previous owner, a man named Fielding Crawford, had been eager to sell Isaac after what he described in correspondence as incidents of an increasingly disturbing nature. Isaac was a man of imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that seemed disproportionately large even for his formidable frame. His most striking feature was his eyes, a pale gray that appeared almost colorless in certain light, giving him an unsettling gaze that made even the most hardened overseers feel deeply uncomfortable. He spoke very little, preferring to communicate through nods and gestures, though those who worked alongside him noted that his silence wasn't born of ignorance, but of careful, calculated observation. What made Isaac particularly valuable to plantation owners was his exceptional skill with a blade. He could dress a hog in half the time it took most men, his knife work so precise that he wasted virtually no meat in the process. His knowledge of anatomy was encyclopedic. He knew exactly where to cut to separate joints, how to remove organs without puncturing them, and how to preserve meat for long-term storage. These skills had made him indispensable at his previous plantation, despite the growing unease his presence seemed to generate among both enslaved and free residents. The incidents that had prompted Crawford to sell Isaac were never fully documented in official records, but whispered accounts spoke of livestock found butchered with unnecessary brutality, their remains arranged in ways that served absolutely no practical purpose. There were also rumors of Isaac being found standing over freshly slaughtered animals long after his work should have been completed, his clothes remaining spotless despite the nature of his labor, as if he had discovered ways to perform his duties without ever getting a single drop of blood on himself. When Cornelius Pettin acquired Isaac in 1844, he believed he was getting a bargain. A skilled laborer at a fraction of the usual cost, Crawford had been so eager to complete the sale that he accepted nearly 30% less than Isaac's assessed value, requiring only that Pettin promise never to sell Isaac back to any plantation in Prince Edward County. For nearly 3 years, Isaac worked at Pettin Grove without incident. He was assigned to manage the plantation's meat production, overseeing the slaughtering of livestock and the preservation of meat for both the family's consumption and for sale to neighboring properties. He worked alone, by his own preference, in a building that had been constructed specifically for this purpose, about 200 yards from the main house. The slaughterhouse was a sturdy brick structure with thick walls and few windows, designed to keep the interior cool even during Virginia's oppressive summers. Inside, Isaac had arranged his tools with military precision, knives of every size and shape hanging from wooden pegs, sharpening stones positioned at exact intervals, and a collection of cleavers that he maintained with obsessive, almost ritualistic care. The building was always immaculately clean, despite the nature of the work performed there, leading some to wonder how Isaac managed to complete his tasks without leaving the usual signs of his profession. The morning of March 15, 1847 began like any other at Petton Grove. The early spring air carried the scent of tobacco, seedlings, and the promise of another profitable growing season. Margaret Petton was in the kitchen garden, directing the preparation of beds for vegetables that would feed the plantation's inhabitants throughout the coming months. The children were at their lessons with their tutor, Professor Aldrich, who came from Richmond twice weekly to ensure they received a proper education, befitting their social station. Cornelius had spent the morning in his study, reviewing accounts and correspondence with factors in Richmond regarding the upcoming tobacco auction. The numbers were encouraging. The previous year's crop had commanded premium prices, and early indicators suggested this year would be even better. By his calculations, the plantation was positioned to generate more profit in 1847 than in any previous year in its history. It was Dr. Jonathan Petton who first noticed that something was terribly wrong. He had arrived at the plantation the previous evening to treat several enslaved workers who had developed symptoms of what appeared to be influenza. As was his custom, he had planned to examine the patients again before departing for his next calls. However, when he approached the quarters shortly after noon, he found them eerily, unnaturally quiet. The doctor's first instinct was that the patients were simply resting, recovering from their illness under the care of old Bessie, the plantation's designated healer. But as he drew closer to the small wooden structures that housed the enslaved population, he became aware of an unusual odor. Not the typical smells associated with the quarters, but something sharper, more metallic. It was then that he noticed the door to Isaac's cabin standing open, swaying slightly in the afternoon breeze. This was highly unusual, as Isaac was known for his intense preference for privacy, and typically kept his door closed, even during the warmest weather. More disturbing was what appeared to be dark stains on the wooden threshold, stains that looked disturbingly similar to dried blood. Dr. Petton approached the cabin with growing apprehension. His medical training had exposed him to blood in many forms, and he immediately recognized the distinctive color and pattern of these stains. They weren't the result of a minor injury or the usual accidents that occurred during manual labor. These stains suggested something far more serious had occurred. Pushing the door fully open, the doctor peered into the cabin's dim interior. What he saw defied immediate comprehension. The usually Spartan room had been transformed into something resembling a macabre exhibition. Isaac's few personal possessions had been arranged with geometric precision, but it was what hung from the cabin's rafters that caused Dr. Petton to stumble backward in horror. Suspended from ropes that appeared to have been measured and cut with mathematical precision were what initially appeared to be sides of pork or beef. But as the doctor's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window, he realized with growing revulsion that these were not animal remains. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate, and the proportions were unmistakably human. Dr. Petton's hands shook violently as he backed away from the cabin, his medical training warring with his primal instinct to flee. He had seen death in many forms during his practice, but nothing had prepared him for the clinical precision with which these remains had been prepared. Each cut appeared to have been made with surgical accuracy, separating joints at exactly the right points, removing organs with a skill that spoke to extensive anatomical knowledge. What disturbed him most was not just the presence of human remains, but their condition. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence in the usual sense. The cuts were clean, methodical, suggesting that whoever had performed this work had taken considerable time and care. It was as if someone had approached the human body with the same professional detachment they might show when butchering livestock. The doctor's legs barely carried him back toward the main house, his mind struggling desperately to process what he had just witnessed. As he stumbled across the plantation grounds, he became aware of other disturbing details he had initially missed. The usual sounds of plantation life were completely absent. No voices calling from the fields, no children playing around the quarters, no cooking fires sending smoke curling into the afternoon sky. When Dr. Petton reached the main house, he found the front door standing ajar. Another detail that struck him as profoundly wrong. Margaret Petton was meticulous about security and would never have left the house unsecured during the day. Calling out for his brother, the doctor received no response. The house, like the quarters, was unnaturally, impossibly quiet. Moving through the ground floor rooms, Dr. Petton found signs of normal daily life abruptly interrupted. In the dining room, the table was set for the midday meal, but the food remained untouched, congealing on china plates that bore the Petton family crest. In the parlor, Margaret's needlework lay abandoned on her favorite chair, the needle still trailing a length of blue silk thread. It was when he reached the foot of the main staircase that Dr. Petton made the discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Dark stains, similar to those he had observed at Isaac's cabin, traced a path up the carpeted stairs, creating a pattern that suggested something heavy had been dragged from the upper floors. The scene that greeted Dr. Jonathan Petton in the upper floors of the Petton mansion would be burned into his memory forever. In what had once been Cornelius's private study, the doctor found his brother's body arranged in a manner that defied all understanding of human behavior. Cornelius sat in his leather chair behind his mahogany desk, his hands positioned as if he had been writing in his ledger. But his head had been removed with surgical precision and placed on the desktop like some grotesque paperweight. The clinical nature of the arrangement was what disturbed Dr. Petton most profoundly. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or scattered papers. The room appeared exactly as it would have on any normal day, except for the impossible presence of his brother's severed head, positioned with careful, deliberate attention to detail. Even more unsettling, Cornelius's body showed no signs of the violent struggle such an act should have required. Moving through the house, in a state approaching complete shock, the doctor discovered that every member of the Petton household had met a similar fate. Margaret was found in the master bedroom, positioned as if she had been arranging flowers in a vase on the dressing table. Her body remained upright, but her head had been removed and placed among the blooms she had been arranging, creating a tableau that was simultaneously artistic and horrifying. The children had been discovered in the nursery, arranged as if they were playing a game. Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and young Mary sat in a circle on the floor, their bodies positioned naturally, but each had been decapitated with the same surgical precision. Their heads had been placed in the center of the circle, facing inward as if they were engaged in quiet conversation. Old Prudence was found in her rocking chair on the back porch, positioned as if she were watching the sunset. Her severed head placed on a small table beside her chair, next to her Bible and reading spectacles. Catherine was discovered in the kitchen, apparently in the midst of preparing bread. Her head placed on the wooden cutting board where she had been working. What made the scene even more disturbing was the complete absence of blood throughout the house. Despite the obvious violence that had occurred, there were no spatters on walls, no pools on floors, no signs of the carnage such acts should have produced. It was as if each person had been killed elsewhere, and then carefully, lovingly positioned in these domestic tablocks. Dr. Petton's medical training allowed him to observe details that others might have missed. The cuts on each body were identical in their precision, made by someone with extensive knowledge of human anatomy. The edges of the wounds were clean, suggesting extremely sharp instruments wielded by remarkably steady hands. Most disturbing of all, there were no defensive wounds on any of the victims. No signs that they had attempted to fight off their attacker. The doctor's examination of the bodies revealed another chilling detail. Each victim appeared to have been killed by a single, precise cut to the neck, made from behind with surgical accuracy. The positioning of the wound suggested that the victims had been completely unaware of their attacker's approach, killed so swiftly and silently that they had no opportunity to react or defend themselves. When Cumberland County Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne arrived at Petton Grove the following morning, summoned by Dr. Petton's frantic midnight ride to the courthouse, he brought with him 2 deputies and the county coroner. What they found challenged every assumption about criminal behavior that their combined decades of experience had provided. Sheriff Hawthorne was a man of considerable experience in dealing with violence on the Virginia frontier. He had investigated murders committed in passion, robberies that had turned deadly, and even the occasional slave uprising that had been violently suppressed. But the scene at Petton Grove was unlike anything in his 20 years of law enforcement. The sheriff's initial focus was on determining how one person could have killed 13 individuals without any of them raising an alarm or attempting to escape. The house showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer had been admitted willingly or had possessed keys to the property. More puzzling was the question of how the bodies had been moved and positioned without leaving the blood trails that such activity should have generated. Coroner William Fitzgerald's preliminary examination of the bodies confirmed Dr. Petton's observations about the precision of the wounds. Each victim had been killed by a single cut that had severed the carotid arteries and jugular veins with surgical accuracy. The instrument used appeared to be extremely sharp and had been wielded by someone with extensive knowledge of human anatomy. What troubled Fitzgerald most was the condition of the bodies. Despite having been deceased for at least 12 hours, when he examined them, they showed none of the usual signs of decomposition. The skin remained pink and warm to the touch, as if death had occurred only minutes earlier. The blood that should have pooled in the lower portions of the bodies was completely absent, as if it had been systematically drained from their systems. The investigation quickly focused on the enslaved population of Petton Grove, both because of the obvious implications of such violence against slaveholders, and because several members of the enslaved community were missing. Along with Isaac, 3 other individuals could not be accounted for: Moses, a field hand in his 30s, Sarah, a house servant who had worked in the Petton kitchen, and Peter, a young man who had assisted Isaac in the slaughterhouse. However, when Sheriff Hawthorne and his deputies searched the slave quarters, they found something that complicated their assumptions about what had occurred. Moses was discovered in his cabin, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. Sarah was found in the kitchen garden, her body positioned as if she had been working among the vegetables. Peter was located in the slaughterhouse, arranged as if he had been cleaning equipment. Like the members of the Petton family, all three enslaved individuals had been decapitated with the same surgical precision. Their heads carefully, deliberately positioned near their bodies. The discovery of these additional victims forced the investigators to completely reconsider their initial theories about the nature of the crime. The search for Isaac intensified as he remained the only unaccounted for resident of Petton Grove. His cabin was thoroughly searched, revealing the disturbing tableau that Dr. Petton had initially discovered. However, closer examination revealed additional details that painted an even more troubling picture of Isaac's activities. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, investigators found a collection of journals written in a careful, educated hand. The entries, dating back nearly 3 years, detailed Isaac's observations of life at Petton Grove with a clinical detachment that chilled even the most seasoned lawmen. He had recorded the daily routines of every resident, both enslaved and free, noting their habits, their fears, their relationships, and their vulnerabilities. The journals discovered in Isaac's cabin would prove to be the key to understanding the methodical horror that had unfolded at Petton Grove. Written in precise handwriting that suggested considerable education, the entries revealed a mind that had been planning and preparing for months, possibly years. Sheriff Hawthorne, despite his limited formal education, immediately recognized the significance of these documents. He arranged for Professor Marcus Aldrich, the children's former tutor, who had been mercifully absent during the massacre, to assist in translating and interpreting Isaac's writings. What they discovered challenged every assumption about Isaac's background and capabilities. The earliest entries, dating to October 1844, shortly after Isaac's arrival at the plantation, were relatively benign observations about plantation life. Isaac had recorded the daily schedules of family members, the routines of other enslaved workers, and detailed notes about the physical layout of the property. However, even these early writings showed an analytical mind at work, someone who observed human behavior with the detachment of a natural scientist studying specimens. As Professor Aldrich worked through the journals chronologically, a disturbing progression became increasingly apparent. Isaac's observations gradually shifted from simple recording to active experimentation. He began testing the reactions of both family members and fellow enslaved individuals to subtle changes in routine, documenting their responses with scientific precision. One entry from December 1844 described how Isaac had deliberately moved small objects in the main house to observe whether family members would notice. He recorded Margaret Petton's reaction when she discovered her favorite vase had been moved 6 inches to the left on the mantelpiece, noting that she had appeared disturbed but unable to articulate the source of her unease. Another entry from February 1845 detailed Isaac's observations of the family's sleeping patterns. He had apparently spent months learning the sounds of the house at night, mapping which floorboards creaked and which doors made noise when opened. His notes revealed an intimate knowledge of the family's nocturnal habits that could only have been gained through careful, sustained surveillance. The journals also contained detailed anatomical drawings that demonstrated Isaac's extensive knowledge of human physiology. These weren't crude sketches, but precise medical illustrations showing bone structure, muscle groups, and organ placement. The level of detail suggested formal training that seemed utterly impossible for an enslaved person in antebellum Virginia. Professor Aldrich's investigation into Isaac's background revealed disturbing inconsistencies in his documented history. While Fielding Crawford had claimed that Isaac had been born on his Prince Edward County plantation, records showed no birth certificate or baptismal record for any enslaved individual by that name. More troubling, Several elderly enslaved people who had lived their entire lives on Crawford's plantation claimed no memory of Isaac before 1842. The professor's inquiries in Prince Edward County revealed additional mysteries surrounding Isaac's past. Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, a physician who had treated enslaved workers on Crawford's plantation, remembered Isaac well, but for reasons that added new layers to the mystery. According to Hutchinson, Isaac had possessed medical knowledge that exceeded that of many trained physicians, particularly in the areas of anatomy and surgical technique. Hutchinson recalled occasions when Isaac had been called upon to assist with medical emergencies involving both human and animal patients. His skill with a knife was so exceptional that Hutchinson had wondered whether Isaac might have received training from a qualified physician, though such education would have been highly unusual for an enslaved person. The doctor's memories of Isaac also included disturbing details about his behavior during medical procedures. Unlike other assistants who showed appropriate emotional responses to suffering, Isaac had remained completely detached, observing procedures with clinical interest rather than human empathy. Hutchinson had found Isaac's presence increasingly unsettling, though he admitted that his assistance had been invaluable in several life-threatening situations. The investigation also revealed that Isaac's departure from Crawford's plantation had been more urgent than initially described. Local records showed that 3 enslaved individuals had died under mysterious circumstances in the months preceding Isaac's sale to Cornelius Petton. While the deaths had been attributed to illness, Dr. Hutchinson's private notes, discovered in his personal papers, suggested that he had harbored deep suspicions about their true cause. The 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, had been found in their quarters, apparently having died peacefully in their sleep. However, Hutchinson's examination had revealed that each had sustained a small puncture wound behind the left ear, so precise and minimal that it was barely visible. The doctor had noted that such wounds could have been made by a thin, sharp instrument inserted with surgical precision to damage the brainstem and cause instant death. Hutchinson's notes indicated that he had shared his suspicions with Crawford, but the plantation owner had been reluctant to pursue an investigation that might have disrupted his operation or attracted unwanted attention from authorities. Instead, Crawford had quietly arranged to sell Isaac to the first buyer who inquired, accepting a significantly reduced price to expedite the transaction. Sheriff Hawthorne's investigation expanded to include other plantations in the region, seeking any information about unusual deaths or disappearances that might be connected to Isaac. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who had moved through Virginia's plantation system like a predator, leaving behind a trail of suspicious deaths and unexplained incidents. Records from Chesterfield County showed that a plantation owner named Benjamin Curthers had briefly owned Isaac in 1843 before selling him to Crawford after what he described as unacceptable behavior. Curthers had been reluctant to provide details, but under pressure from Sheriff Hawthorne, he admitted that several of his most valuable enslaved workers had died during Isaac's brief tenure on his property. The deaths had occurred over a period of just 3 months, each victim found in circumstances that suggested natural death, but which Curthers had found increasingly suspicious. Like the deaths on Crawford's plantation, each individual had been discovered with a small, nearly invisible wound behind the left ear. Curthers revealed that he had begun to suspect Isaac after observing his behavior around the bodies of the deceased. While other enslaved individuals had shown appropriate grief and respect for their departed community members, Isaac had displayed clinical interest in the corpses, examining them with the detachment of a medical professional conducting an autopsy. The plantation owner's suspicions had been confirmed when he discovered Isaac in the quarters late one night, standing over the body of a recently deceased woman, holding what appeared to be a thin, pointed instrument. When confronted, Isaac had calmly explained that he was studying the effects of death on human tissue, a response that had so disturbed Curthers that he had arranged Isaac's sale within days. The mounting evidence of Isaac's deadly progression through Virginia's plantation system created a sense of urgent alarm among law enforcement officials. If Isaac had indeed been responsible for numerous deaths across multiple counties, his disappearance represented a threat that extended far beyond Cumberland County. Sheriff Hawthorne coordinated with his counterparts in neighboring jurisdictions to establish a network of communication and coordinated search efforts. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Dr. Pettin received an unexpected visitor at his temporary residence in Cumberland Courthouse. Samuel Woodson, a free black man who worked as a blacksmith in nearby Farmville, approached the doctor with information that would fundamentally alter their understanding of Isaac's true identity. Woodson claimed to have known Isaac years earlier, before his appearance on any Virginia plantation. According to Woodson, Isaac had not been born into slavery at all, but had been a free man living in Philadelphia, where he had worked as an assistant to a prominent anatomist and physician. The circumstances that had led to his enslavement were, according to Woodson, far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. The blacksmith's account painted a picture of a man whose intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an obsessive fascination with death and human anatomy. Isaac, whose original name had been Isaac Thornton, had reportedly assisted Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a Philadelphia physician who specialized in surgical procedures and anatomical research. However, Woodson claimed that Isaac's interest in his work had gradually evolved from professional curiosity to something far darker. According to Woodson's account, Isaac had been discovered by Dr. Whitfield conducting unauthorized experiments on corpses in the medical college's anatomy laboratory. These experiments had gone far beyond the legitimate study of human anatomy, involving what Woodson described as natural manipulations of deceased bodies for no apparent medical purpose. When confronted by Dr. Whitfield, Isaac had apparently shown no remorse or recognition that his behavior was inappropriate. Instead, he had calmly explained that he was exploring the artistic possibilities of human anatomy, treating the human body as if it were raw material for sculptural work, rather than the remains of deceased individuals. Dr. Whitfield had immediately terminated Isaac's employment and banned him from the medical college. However, within weeks of his dismissal, several corpses had been discovered missing from the college's anatomy laboratory. More disturbingly, the bodies of 3 recently deceased Philadelphia residents had been found in abandoned buildings, arranged in poses that suggested they had been used for some form of macabre artistic expression. The Philadelphia authorities had sought Isaac for questioning in connection with these incidents, but he had vanished from the city before they could locate him. Woodson believed that Isaac had been captured by slave catchers while attempting to flee south, possibly mistaken for a runaway slave due to his mixed racial heritage and lack of free papers. This account, if true, explained many of the mysteries surrounding Isaac's background and capabilities. His extensive knowledge of anatomy, his surgical skills, and his deeply disturbing behavior, all aligned with Woodson's description of a man who had received formal medical training but whose interests had evolved in dangerous, deadly directions. Dr. Pettin found Woodson's account both compelling and utterly terrifying. If Isaac was indeed a formally trained anatomist who had been forced into slavery, his years of bondage might have transformed his scholarly interest in death into something far more personal and vengeful. The systematic nature of the Petton Grove massacre suggested not just homicidal intent, but a carefully planned act of retribution. The investigation received additional urgency when reports began reaching Cumberland County of suspicious incidents on plantations throughout central Virginia. A stable in Buckingham County reported the discovery of livestock that had been slaughtered and arranged in disturbing patterns that served absolutely no practical purpose. Another plantation in Charlotte County found several enslaved workers dead in their quarters, each bearing the now familiar small puncture wound behind the left ear. Most alarming was a report from Nottoway County describing the disappearance of an entire family of plantation owners, leaving behind a house that showed no signs of violence, but where investigators found evidence suggesting the family had been systematically stalked for weeks before their disappearance. Sheriff Hawthorne organized search parties that scoured the countryside for any sign of Isaac, focusing on areas that would provide shelter and access to the tools he would need to continue his deadly work. Abandoned buildings, unused barns, and remote caves were all thoroughly searched, but no trace of the fugitive was discovered. The search was complicated by the fact that descriptions of Isaac varied significantly among those who had encountered him. Some described him as tall and imposing, others as average in height and unremarkable in appearance. His ability to blend into different environments and adopt different personas suggested a level of sophistication that made him particularly dangerous. As weeks passed without any solid leads, the investigation began to focus on Isaac's possible motivations and ultimate objectives. Professor Aldrich's continued analysis of the journals revealed increasingly disturbing insights into Isaac's psychological state during his time at Petton Grove. The later entries in the journals showed a clear progression from clinical observation to active planning for what Isaac had begun to refer to as his final experiment. These entries described detailed plans for the systematic elimination of everyone on the plantation, not as an act of revenge, but as what he termed an exploration of the aesthetic possibilities of mass mortality. Isaac had apparently viewed the Petton Grove massacre as an artistic statement, arranging the bodies of his victims to create tableaux that he believed demonstrated the beauty inherent in death. His journals contained sketches showing how he had planned to position each victim, treating the human bodies as mere components in a larger composition. The journals also revealed that Isaac had not acted alone in planning the massacre. References to the disciples and fellow students of the art suggested that he had been in communication with others who shared his disturbed interests. These references were cryptic and indirect, but they raised the terrifying possibility that Isaac was part of a larger network of individuals with similar proclivities. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cumberland County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of calculated terror. The breakthrough in the Isaac investigation came from an entirely unexpected source. Father O'Sullivan, the Irish priest who served the Catholic families scattered throughout Cumberland and surrounding counties, approached Sheriff Hawthorne with information that would finally explain both Isaac's whereabouts and the true scope of his activities. Father O'Sullivan had been conducting his monthly circuit of remote farmsteads when he encountered a group of travelers on the road between Cumberland Courthouse and Farmville. The group, consisting of 3 men and 1 woman, had been dressed as itinerant preachers, but had behaved in ways that immediately aroused the priest's suspicions. Most disturbing was their leader, a tall man with pale eyes who had insisted on discussing theological questions related to death and resurrection. The conversation, according to Father O'Sullivan, had focused obsessively on the physical aspects of death and the condition of the human body after the soul's departure. The man had demonstrated knowledge of anatomy that exceeded anything the priest had encountered outside of medical schools. But his interest had seemed more artistic than scientific. What had truly alarmed Father O'Sullivan was the man's description of recent religious experiences he claimed to have had. He spoke of receiving divine inspiration to help others transcend the limitations of mortal flesh, and described visions in which he had been instructed to create living sculptures using human bodies. The man had claimed that through his work, he was helping souls achieve a more perfect union with their Creator. The priest's description of the group's leader matched witness accounts of Isaac. But more importantly, Father O'Sullivan had observed the group traveling toward Powhatan County, where they claimed to be planning a great revival meeting that would demonstrate their unique approach to spiritual enlightenment. Sheriff Hawthorne immediately dispatched riders to alert his counterpart in Powhatan County and began organizing a pursuit party. However, before they could depart Cumberland County, they received word that their destination had already been determined. A plantation owner named Colonel William Randolph had sent an urgent message requesting immediate assistance with what he described as the most horrific crime ever perpetrated in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The scene that greeted law enforcement officials at even the horrors exceeded at horrors discovered at Patton Grove. The colonial-era mansion, which had been in the Randolph family since the 1600s, had been transformed into what could only be described as a gallery of human death. In the main parlor, 17 members of the household had been arranged in an elaborate tableau that depicted what appeared to be a formal dinner party. Each victim had been positioned with meticulous attention to detail, seated around the massive mahogany dining table, with their severed heads placed on china plates before them. The arrangement had been designed to create the illusion that the family was sharing a meal together, even in death. Candles had been lit around the room, casting flickering shadows that gave the macabre scene an almost festive atmosphere. But it was in the mansion's ballroom that investigators discovered the true extent of Isaac's artistic vision. The bodies of 32 enslaved individuals from the plantation had been arranged in dancing poses, their heads replaced with the heads of various family members to create the impression of an integrated social gathering that would have been utterly impossible in life. The precision required to create such a scene spoke to hours, possibly days, of methodical, unhurried work. Dr. Petton, who had accompanied the law enforcement team to provide medical expertise, found evidence that Isaac had been assisted by at least 3 other individuals. The sheer scope of the work, combined with witness accounts of the traveling preacher group, confirmed that Isaac had successfully recruited disciples who shared his disturbed, deadly vision. The investigation of the Randolph plantation revealed additional evidence of Isaac's evolving methodology. Unlike the instantaneous deaths at Patton Grove, several of the Randolph victims showed signs of having been kept alive during the initial stages of their ordeal. The chilling implication was that Isaac and his followers had refined their techniques to extract maximum psychological impact from their victims' final moments. Hidden in the plantation's root cellar, investigators discovered what appeared to be Isaac's field laboratory. The underground chamber had been converted into a surgical suite, complete with medical instruments, anatomical charts, and detailed notes describing various experimental procedures. Most disturbing were the detailed sketches showing planned arrangements for future victims, suggesting that the Randolph plantation had been just one stop in a larger, ongoing campaign of terror. The laboratory contained evidence that Isaac had been conducting what he termed anatomical studies on living subjects before killing them. Restraining devices had been constructed with carpenter's precision, designed to hold victims completely immobile while Isaac performed procedures that had no medical purpose beyond satisfying his morbid curiosity about human pain responses and the mechanics of death. Pettin's examination of the laboratory notes revealed that Isaac had been documenting the effects of various injuries on his victims' ability to remain conscious and articulate. These experiments appeared to be designed to determine the optimal methods for prolonging awareness during the dying process, allowing Isaac to observe and record the psychological impact of approaching death. The investigation took its most crucial turn when Sheriff Hawthorne discovered evidence that Isaac and his disciples had not yet completed their work at the Randolph plantation. Fresh supplies had been delivered to the laboratory within the previous 48 hours, including surgical instruments that showed no signs of use. More ominously, detailed maps of neighboring plantations had been found with specific locations marked and annotated. The maps revealed that Isaac had conducted extensive surveillance of at least 6 additional properties in Powhatan and Cumberland counties. Each location had been studied with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his earlier attacks. Guard schedules, family routines, and structural layouts had all been documented with military precision. Most alarming was the discovery of a detailed timeline showing planned attacks extending through the summer months of 1847. Isaac had apparently envisioned a campaign of terror that would ultimately encompass dozens of plantations throughout central Virginia. His notes suggested that he viewed each attack as part of a larger artistic work, with individual massacres serving as chapters in what he called his treatise on the aesthetics of mortality. The timeline indicated that Isaac's net target was the Plantation plantation in Cumberland County, a property located less than 10 miles from where Sheriff Hawthorne was conducting his investigation, with the loyalty. According to Isaac's notes, the attack was scheduled for the following evening, timed to coincide with a planned dinner party that would place the maximum number of victims in a single location. Sheriff Hawthorne immediately dispatched riders to warn the Carrington family while organizing the largest manhunt in Virginia's history. Every available law enforcement officer from 5 counties converged on the area between the Randolph and Carrington plantations, determined to intercept Isaac before he could claim additional victims. The manhunt was complicated by Isaac's apparent ability to move through the countryside without detection. His knowledge of anatomy extended to understanding how tracking dogs located fugitives, and evidence suggested that he had been using various substances to mask his scent and confuse pursuing animals. The search parties found numerous false trails and dead ends, indicating that Isaac was actively working to evade capture. As evening approached on what Isaac's timeline indicated would be the night of the Carrington attack, law enforcement officials had still found no trace of the fugitive or his disciples. The difficult decision was made to use the Carrington plantation as bait, positioning armed officers throughout the property, while allowing the planned dinner party to proceed under heavy but concealed security. Colonel James Carrington, a veteran of the War of 1812 and an experienced military commander, insisted on maintaining normal household routines to avoid alerting Isaac that his plans had been discovered. The dinner party proceeded as scheduled, with 12 guests and family members dining in the main house, while nearly 30 armed men waited in concealment around the property. The attack came not from the direction anyone had anticipated. Rather than approaching the main house directly, Isaac and his disciples had apparently spent days tunneling beneath the plantation grounds, using their knowledge of the property's layout to create an underground network that allowed them to emerge inside the house itself. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when one of the dinner guests, Mrs. Elizabeth Carrington, commented that she could hear what sounded like scratching beneath the dining room floor. Before anyone could respond to her observation, sections of the wooden flooring began to give way, and 4 figures emerged from beneath the house with the sudden, shocking violence of predators springing from ambush. Isaac's appearance had changed dramatically since his disappearance from Petton Grove. His hair had grown long and unkempt, and his clothes were stained with substances that the dinner guests preferred not to identify. Most disturbing was his expression. The clinical detachment that witnesses had described had been replaced by something approaching religious ecstasy, as if he viewed his deadly work as a form of worship. The 3 disciples who accompanied Isaac were equally transformed. 2 appeared to be former enslaved individuals who had somehow joined Isaac's cause, while the third was recognizably white, possibly an overseer or small farmer who had been recruited into Isaac's twisted philosophy. All 4 moved with practiced coordination, suggesting extensive planning and rehearsal. The attack that followed was unlike anything in the previous massacres. Rather than the swift surgical killings that had characterized Isaac's earlier work, the assault on the Carrington dinner party became a prolonged ordeal designed to maximize psychological impact. Isaac and his disciples had apparently decided to abandon stealth in favor of conducting their work in full view of living witnesses. The hidden law enforcement officers, caught completely off guard by the attackers' method of entry, found themselves unable to intervene without risking the lives of the dinner guests. The dining room had become a confined space where any gunfire might prove as dangerous to victims as to perpetrators. Isaac's behavior during the attack revealed the full extent of his psychological deterioration. He moved through the room like a conductor directing an orchestra, positioning his disciples and issuing instructions with calm authority while chaos erupted around him. His primary focus seemed to be on creating another of his disturbing tableaux, treating the terror of living victims as simply another component in his artistic vision. The standoff in the Carrington dining room lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which time Isaac demonstrated the full extent of his psychological manipulation skills. Rather than immediately killing his captives, he engaged them in what he described as philosophical discussions about the nature of death and the human soul's relationship to physical existence. Isaac's monologue, witnessed by law enforcement officers positioned outside the dining room windows, revealed the twisted logic that had driven his campaign of terror. He spoke of death as the ultimate artistic medium, claiming that the arrangement of lifeless human bodies allowed him to create beauty that transcended the limitations of conventional art. In his mind, he was not committing murder, but rather crafting sculptures using the finest materials available. The captive dinner guests, paralyzed by fear and the immediate threat of violence, found themselves unwilling participants in Isaac's deranged philosophy lesson. he forced them to examine the bodies of 2 victims he had already killed, pointing out what he considered the aesthetic qualities of their final poses and explaining his techniques for preserving the appearance of life, even after death. Dr. Petton, observing from his concealed position outside the house, recognized that Isaac's behavior had evolved far beyond simple homicidal intent. The man had developed an elaborate intellectual framework that allowed him to view his crimes as contributions to human knowledge and artistic expression. His disciples nodded approvingly at his explanations, suggesting that they had fully embraced his twisted worldview. The breakthrough came when Colonel Carrington, drawing on his military experience, managed to signal the concealed officers using a prearranged code involving the position of his hands on the dining table. The signal indicated that Isaac and his disciples had positioned themselves in a formation that would allow coordinated gunfire to neutralize all 4 attackers without endangering the remaining hostages. The assault was swift and decisive. Windows exploded inward as law enforcement officers simultaneously breached the dining room from 3 directions. Isaac, caught in the middle of explaining his anatomical techniques to a terrified Mrs. Carrington, had no opportunity to react before multiple rifle balls struck him center mass. His 3 disciples attempted to use their hostages as human shields, but the officers' positioning had been planned to prevent such tactics. Within seconds, all 4 attackers lay dead on the Carrington dining room floor, their blood mingling with that of their earlier victims in a final, unintended tableau. Isaac's death ended the immediate threat, but the investigation into his activities would continue for months. The subsequent examination of his laboratory and journals revealed evidence linking him to suspicious deaths across 6 counties, spanning nearly 4 years. Conservative estimates suggested that Isaac and his disciples had been responsible for the deaths of over 100 individuals, making them among the most prolific killer in American history. The discovery of correspondence in Isaac's laboratory revealed that his network of disciples had extended far beyond the 3 men killed at the Carrington Plantation. Letters from individuals in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia suggested that Isaac had been recruiting followers across the entire southeastern United States, spreading his philosophy of death as art to receptive minds in the slaveholding regions. Law enforcement agencies throughout the South coordinated efforts to track down these additional disciples, leading to arrests and investigations that continued well into 1848. Several individuals were identified as having participated in suspicious deaths that bore Isaac's distinctive characteristics, though many others successfully evaded capture by fleeing to the Western Territories. The psychological impact of Isaac's campaign extended far beyond his direct victims. Plantation owners throughout Virginia implemented unprecedented security measures, fundamentally altering the relationship between enslaved and free populations. The realization that someone with Isaac's intelligence and skills could operate undetected for years created a climate of suspicion that poisoned social relationships across the entire region. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Isaac's philosophy had found adherents among both enslaved and free populations. His journals contained letters from supporters who praised his work and expressed genuine interest in learning his techniques. The idea that systematic killing could be justified as artistic expression had apparently resonated with individuals whose resentments and grievances had led them to embrace violence as a form of creative expression. The official investigation concluded with a report that was immediately classified and sealed by Virginia authorities. The document, not discovered until after the Civil War, revealed that Isaac's true identity remained a mystery despite extensive investigation. Samuel Woodson's account of Isaac's Philadelphia background could never be verified, and no records of an Isaac Thornton matching his description could be found in Pennsylvania. The report speculated that Isaac might have been an educated free black man who had deliberately entered the slave system to gain access to potential victims, or possibly a white man whose mixed racial heritage had allowed him to pass as enslaved when convenient. His sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to manipulate both individual victims and entire communities suggested formal education that exceeded anything typically available to enslaved individuals. More troubling was the report's conclusion that Isaac's campaign represented not an isolated incident, but possibly the beginning of a larger movement. References in his correspondence suggested that similar individuals were operating in other slaveholding regions, using the cover of the plantation system to pursue their deadly interests. The investigators recommended ongoing surveillance and coordination between law enforcement agencies to identify and neutralize additional threats. The legacy of Isaac's crimes would influence Virginia society for decades to come. The systematic nature of his attacks and his ability to operate undetected for years highlighted vulnerabilities in the plantation system that had previously been ignored. The realization that enslaved individuals could possess sophisticated knowledge and planning capabilities forced slaveholders to reconsider their assumptions about the people they held in bondage. The case also revealed the dangers inherent in a social system that allowed individuals to move between properties with minimal documentation or verification. Isaac's ability to assume new identities and gain access to multiple plantations had been facilitated by the informal networks through which enslaved people were bought and sold, creating opportunities for predators to exploit the system's weaknesses. In the end, the true horror of Isaac's story lay not in the supernatural or unexplainable, but in the calculated application of human intelligence to the pursuit of evil. His crimes demonstrated that the capacity for systematic violence existed within the normal parameters of human behavior, requiring only the right combination of opportunity, skill, and twisted motivation to manifest in devastating ways. This mystery shows us how easily evil can hide behind the facade of normalcy, and how systems of oppression can provide cover for the most heinous crimes. The meticulous planning and execution of Isaac's campaign reminds us that the greatest monsters are often those who appear most rational and controlled. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Isaac's true identity and motives? Leave your comment below and let me know which historical mysteries from your area you'd like us to investigate next. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkest chapters of American history are often the ones that were deliberately hidden. And together, we'll continue uncovering the secrets that powerful people tried to bury forever. See you in the next video.